Hi everybody. Hello out there in Zoom land. My name is Erica Bender, and I'm an assessment specialist at the University of California, Davis. A lot of my focus lately has been thinking about assessment in the time of AI and helping faculty and instructors think about how they design not only their assignments and assessments, but also just really thinking about their learning outcomes in this era where we have the proliferation of these tools. Um, I want to say before I really jump in that even though the title of the session is assessing AI literacy, I want to be mindful of my terminology because what I'm really talking about here is generative AI. There are so many different kinds of AI tools out there, and many of the AI that are proliferating today have their foundation in AI tools that have existed for a really, really long time. So AI has long been part of what Netflix recommends for you, right? AI has long been part of your social media feeds and the ways that information comes to you in the world. AI has long been a part of that. AI has long been a part of business analytics and other kinds of analytic fields. And so AI is not necessarily new, but what is new, and I think why higher education finds itself in this moment of existential panic, is that generative AI, and particularly in the form of mass consumer, highly popular generative AI technologies, where individual users can type something in or load something into some interface, and then that interface scrapes a lot of data to produce something out of that. Those tools, and in terms of their mass popularization, that is something that's relatively new. So I think these days a lot of folks just use the word AI, and we probably should be more mindful of our terms. That what we're really talking about here, what I'm talking about most of the time, is how do we cultivate literacy in students in their use of generative AI technology? Because most of my students anyway are not necessarily working on the analytics side of AI just yet, but a lot of them are using ChatGPT. So that's sort of really what I'm focusing on here. I'm going to keep using AI, probably out of sheer laziness, to be totally honest. But please keep in mind that when I say AI in this context of this presentation, I'm really talking about generative AI technologies, primarily in the form of text-based chatbots in the form of Copilot, ChatGPT, Gemini, and things like that. Although those tools now go beyond text generation as well. So um, I would like to start us off today. Hi, Melissa. Just saw you in the chat. I'd like to start us off today with a very, very light. I know you've been on Zoom all day. It's 2 in the afternoon on a Friday. So a very, very light chat-based warm-up. And that is, how would you self-assess your own AI literacy, or if we expanded that, your own generative AI literacy? And before you're like, I don't even know what that means, here's a very general description. So AI literacy means having the essential abilities that people need to live, learn, and work in our digital world through AI-driven technologies. So with this working definition of AI literacy, how would you self-assess your own AI literacy on a scale of 1 to 4? So put a 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat. 1 is like, it's not good, y'all. I don't like it. I don't get it. I don't want to get it. I'm not interested. 2 is like, okay, it's going okay. 3 is good. I'm mostly going well. And 4 is great. I really know what's happening. I really know what I'm doing out there. I'm highly motivated. So where would you rate yourself? Okay, lots of 2s and 3s, a 4 in there. Very nice. A couple of 4s. Very good. I guess I should do this myself. I don't know. I think I'm probably somewhere between a 3 and a 4, but I'm now in that space of like, I feel like I know a lot, which means I must not know as much as I think I do. So that's where I'm at with these tools. Thanks. And I appreciate also the decimals. This is a line, so you could have done a 2.1 or a 3.6 or something like that. So maybe I put myself at a 3.2. So I think it's important to start with this because it's kind of the guiding question of of my talk, but also my own sort of personal journey. So I want to just briefly share with you my personal relationship with Gen AI, a story told in 4 acts, mostly with dog memes. So when take yourself back to November 2022, ChatGPT comes on the market, everybody's freaking out, and my initial thought was, nah, I really don't. I really don't know. I like this is just another tool. This is not going to really be able to produce texts that are really contextual. It'll probably be able to produce like really generic things, but like I don't know. Um, and then, as both as I started using these technologies, as I started seeing what they were capable of, and as the technologies themselves started to evolve, I was like, "Oh no, this is not great." Actually, that skepticism was probably a little premature on my part. These tools really are quite powerful, and students do seem to use them for a variety of purposes. Not sort of want to get away from the narrative that students are only using these to get out of work, but they're using them for a lot of different reasons. Excuse me. And so I started really thinking, like, oh gosh, like this really does potentially represent a major technological shift and sea change. I think I got to that point around like January 2023, so just a couple months later. And then from there, we're just like, let's use it. Let's have the students use it. Let's use it ourselves. Let's use it for this. Let's use it for that. Let's just create all kinds of stuff with these tools because why not? And it's here. And then, of course, as we learn more and more about the costs of these technologies, not just in terms of the environmental and social costs, but also the cost to our own thinking and our own creativity, you know, I pulled away from that. And now eventually I have settled on this place of like, no, don't just embrace it. Let's embrace it with an eye towards literacy. And I feel very self accomplished by reaching this conclusion. If you reach this conclusion in November 2022, I applaud you. I really, really do. Because it took me probably 7 to 8 months of interacting with this environment and this field really for me to get to that point. Um, but then the question, the sequel of the story is how do we actually cultivate AI literacy? Because this is like one of my favorite pictures of this dog walking itself. Because I feel like when it comes to cultivating AI literacy, we don't necessarily have a guidebook. When it comes to other core competencies like critical thinking and other kinds of information literacy, I really think that we have been cultivating those skills ever since we were students. So when it comes to teaching students about other kinds of competencies, we have a lot of experience in those competencies already. But now here we are where this technology, this mass popularization of these particular tools, just in the last couple of years, once they arrive on the scene, we have to actually really quickly develop our competencies in those areas. Um, but at the same time, we don't necessarily have a lot of tools and resources to do so because the field is really emergent and the field of how individual academics use this is also very, very emergent. And so this is where I'm currently at of like I'm on this journey and come on the journey with me. And so that's sort of where we are. And so I have this guiding. Oh, let me just briefly share that AI literacy, as we discussed, means having these essential abilities that people need to live, learn, and work in our digital world through AI driven technologies. You've heard that already. But slightly hotter take from Jose Antonio Bowen, is that actually he thinks that AI literacy training should be mandated and required for all faculty. He says this was just recently in LinkedIn, just like a couple weeks ago. None of us like mandatory anything, but isn't it time that we require all faculty and staff to learn about what is an increasingly ubiquitous technology in all of our lives? You may say yes, you may say no. I'm not really sure I'm ready to take a stance on that just yet. But we're facing this tension, right? That we need these skills. These are essential skills and abilities that we need for the 21st century. But we're not necessarily faced with a robust infrastructure to actually cultivate those skills, let alone self-assess where we are at on those skills, let alone teach and assess those skills with our students. So this is just a giant nest of confusion in my experience. And so I have this guiding question that I think has been um, really pushing me for the last several months, which is how can we teach students about AI literacy when we're still developing our own AI literacy? And I think it's actually quite a fundamental question because um, most of us, when we go into a classroom to teach students, we are already granted a position of authority, and not just authority in the eyes of the institution, our ability to meter out punishment and grades and things like that, but we're given a kind of academic and philosophical authority. And for a long time, we've been talking about ways that instructors need to integrate more active learning by being guides on the side rather than sage on the stage. But that is something that I think we are still contending with in this environment with AI is how do we actually embrace the fact that when it comes to using generative AI technologies, we are also novice learners and we are novice learners right alongside of our students. Another way to ask this question is how do you design assessment and learning activities around AI literacy as a learning outcome if you're not already an expert in that outcome? Most of us are teaching courses in fields that we have broad expertise in because we've been working or learning in those fields for a very long time. But if this is new, how do you actually design an entire course? Or maybe even if not an entire course, a unit within a course that has specified learning outcomes and then scaffolded and aligned activities and assessments that get to that learning outcome. To me, it's a quite a struggle of a question, and it's actually a practical one because recognizing the lack of AI focused instruction to students on my campus, I propose to teach a seminar called Living and Learning in an AI World. And happily the seminar was accepted. And so I was facing this class that I had to teach. I had 20 students who are going to be sitting in a classroom waiting for me to deliver some instruction on a class of this title, where the entire focus of the class was supporting students in their journey towards critical AI literacy. And so having an answer to this question was really profound and necessary for me in the very recent past. And so I went on a journey of my own to find AI literacy frameworks. As I mentioned, AI has been a field for a long time. And so there are several emergent frameworks around AI that predate the release of ChatGPT in 2022. But since then, man, those frameworks have proliferated. If you do a Google search or a Google Scholar search for AI literacy or AI literacy framework, you are going to be quickly overwhelmed by the volume of everyone throwing their voice into the chorus. So it's frameworks, competencies, outcomes. Oh my, there's so many different specifications and configurations of AI literacy that are out there that for when I was planning my course, for example, I found 20 different frameworks and sets of outcomes. And I just quickly was like, this is making my head spin. But I want to share what a lot of those literacy frameworks actually have in common. If you were to read all of them, you would probably see this yourself. But I think this will continue as even more come out. But what a lot of these frameworks, in my experience, have in common is that there is already a connection to and often a departure from some kind of existing literacy framework. Most often, that's the digital literacy frameworks or information literacy frameworks, some computer literacy frameworks. Um, but a lot of time that's sort of the starting point. But then, even though they start from the area of digital literacy, most of these scholars and frameworks depart from that space pretty quickly as a way of putting forth their own framework for AI literacy in particular. Many of the frameworks utilize Bloom's taxonomy as a heuristic and a starting point. So they characterize AI literacy along the Bloom's taxonomy heuristic. You can all probably picture that pyramid where remember is the base of the pyramid and create is at the apex of the pyramid. And a lot of scholars are fitting their frameworks of AI literacy into that taxonomy for reasons that are useful and less useful, in my opinion. Almost all of these frameworks are going to encompass multiple dimensions or interconnected skills and competencies with AI. We'll get to some of those in just a moment. And there's no really clear consensus on which framework is best. I think a lot of people are scrambling to get their framework or their their measures and their outcomes and competencies validated across multiple contexts. But even though there's not a lot of clear consensus, I do think there's a lot of points of overlap. So what I'm going to attempt to do for you today is synthesize some of these things and try to simplify some of these things so that you could put some of these things to use, some of these ideas of AI literacy to use with yourself and with your students right away. So to do that, I'm going to present just a sample. These are my four, I wouldn't even say these are my four favorite, but these are four that I tend to find myself going back to again and again when it comes to how do we design an AI literacy framework. So I'm just going to kind of walk through each of these four. Again, this is just a sample of many, many possible frameworks that are out there, but these are the four that I tend to use the most. So the first is by Ng and a bunch of co-authors, and they specify AI literacy in these four different domains. There's cognitive domains, affective domains, behavioral domains, and ethical domains. All of the cognitive domains are just Bloom's taxonomy. Know and understand AI, use and apply AI, evaluate and create AI. So again, that we see that Bloom's taxonomy framework coming up. The affective and behavioral domains have more to do with how students recognize themselves and work together and engender certain behaviors in their use of generative AI. I will say that of all the frameworks I've read, this is the only one that actually specifies affective domains and behavioral domains to this extent. For other frameworks, they're kind of collapsed into other things. And these authors also pull ethical domains out as a separate space. So in other frameworks, you might see ethics kind of integrated into other pieces. They pull ethics out as a separate domain and they put into that responsibility and critical thinking. Those are all aspects of the ethical domain for this framework. The second framework that I tend to use very often is the Biagini framework. Biagini and their authors. These are actually folks from Italy. And at first, I can only find papers in Italian, but luckily, a lot of their papers have also been translated. But they have these also similar multi-dimensionality, but where they sort of pull out from the first framework that I reviewed is really specifying on an operational domain. So in the first framework, they put know and understand, use and apply, evaluate and create all under one domain. But in the second framework, they're actually kind of pulling those things out into separate domains. And so there's a knowledge domain where there's an understanding of fundamental AI concepts, understanding different kinds of AI types and different things like machine learning principles and things like that. And then in the operational domain, it's the actual using of the AI. So applying different AI concepts, using different AI tools to solve problems and enhance thinking. The critical domain, again, in the first framework, that was all collapsed into one cognitive domain, but the critical domain is having some critical discernment and evaluation of the AI. And like the first framework, this framework also puts ethical domain on its own sort of separate footing. So responsible and ethical use, understanding of AI's ethical issues, and attention to ethics of AI use among the students. So that's the second one. The third framework is from the University of Adelaide, and they actually draw on the first framework quite a lot. But unlike the first framework, there isn't one cognitive dimension. Those cognitive dimensions are kind of spread out across the other four dimensions. So similar, you can kind of start to see a pattern here. The first dimension in this framework is recognizing and understanding what AI is and how it works. Second piece or second domain dimension of this framework is being able to use and apply AI. So generating reliable and accurate output, applying the appropriate AI tool for the context. So using the right tool for the task, documenting and acknowledging the use of AI according to the academic conventions that the student is working with. So whereas in other frameworks, they would have put the ethics and responsible use under its own separate category, this is saying actually having a responsible use is part of using and applying AI. So if you can't be responsible as you're using it, then it's not sufficient, right? Then you're not actually using it very well. And the use and apply literacy has not been achieved if you're not actually using it responsibly. So just a subtle difference there. Similarly, evaluating and critiquing AI, this is one of the few not the few frameworks, but this is one that calls attention directly to students knowing the limitations of AI as part of how they evaluate it, and then reflect and respect. So again, kind of separate ethical dimension, using it ethically and appreciating the impacts of AI and the costs of AI for our society, our politics, our economy, things like that. And then this one, the fourth framework that I'll go over is I think the most unique of all the ones I've seen, mostly because it doesn't align to Bloom's taxonomy at all. Most of the time, as I mentioned, these frameworks really build on Bloom's taxonomy as a heuristic, but this framework really doesn't. And I thought it was quite interesting when I first read it. And so in this framework, there is a focus on, can students apply and use these tools? Can they do so authentically? So focusing on what they really want to say and having genuine communication between the writer and the audience, or themselves and the reader, or the person who's going to be reviewing their work. Can they be responsible and take responsibility for AI influenced content and using AI in a fair and equitable manner? And then what I really liked about this framework more than anything else was this focus on agency. And I think going back to that first framework, there was that attention on affect and behavior. And I think agency is a really nice term for, yeah, for encapsulating that. This idea that when students are using AI, they're retaining control. They're being the human in the loop. They understand what they're doing, and they have the ability to kind of metacognitively make choices both in that interaction as well as how they think about and use the content that's produced by the AI. And I just really appreciated that attention. So I wanted to just sort of pause and ask, what do you notice about all of these? I just sort of quickly reviewed 4 different ways of thinking about this. What do you notice and what do you wonder? Yeah, so metacognition is crucial. Does anyone notice anything about how these sort of frameworks are getting organized, or how we're sort of, how scholars seem to be organizing their own brains around such a large topic? Excuse me. Feel free to put it in the chat, or feel free to come on mic. Well, that's fine. So I will just share. Again, I was kind of awash. Yes, for sure. I do too, Shelley. That focus on agency and me being in control to me was really, really valuable. It's not really something I saw very prominently in any of the other frameworks that I reviewed. And so yeah, and the key, one of the things that you'll see here is this a big focus on ethics and responsibility. There's a very clear and explicit focus on the ethics of AI use and how we teach students to be responsible AI users. So I think one of the things that I noticed with this is that there seems to be many points of overlap between these, overlap, but also sort of not overlap. And so here's what here's what I did to kind of put it all together, and sort of tracing like an idea or a facet and how it connects to each of these 4 frameworks that we just reviewed. So when I see these, I see that AI literacy seems to entail understanding what AI is and also what AI entails. So that means understanding the basic idea of where AI comes from. How does it work? And the metaphor that I often use with my students is, you don't have to be a mechanic to drive a car, but you have to know what a car is to drive a car. You have to know some of the basic functionalities of this technology in order to use it well. And so that seems to be cutting across all of these, is that students need to have some awareness of what machine learning is, what large language models are, what training data means, and how training data influences the tool and things like that. So they don't need to be mechanics, but they need to know the car, so to speak. A second thing that I think AI literacy entails is some kind of operational skills for putting AI to use. Notice that none of the frameworks I reviewed really dug into prompt engineering, right? No, I just didn't see that anywhere. And maybe it's because the frameworks that we're looking at were all mostly pre 2022. So prompt engineering was not really a thing in our vernacular. But I would put prompting and skills for selecting an AI tool, recognizing the difference between them, but also actually putting those prompt engineering principles into use to getting the most out of the tool. So thinking about the input and the output of the tool and how you can put certain kinds of things into a tool in order to get certain kinds of things out of it. So I would call all of that kind of operational uh, skill. And yeah, Melissa, to your point, yes, we don't really know what's happening in these tools, or because they are black box. But even that is, I would put that under what AI entails, is like some combination of like billions of weights and computations happening at a speed we can't quite grasp and to ends we don't quite understand. Um, the third thing that I think AI literacy entails across all of these different frameworks is some kind of critical discernment of how the student is using AI and also the output that they're getting from that. So, fact checking the AI, recognizing that the AI makes mistakes and that it's probably going to fabricate things because it wants to satisfy the user rather than satisfy some more objective quote unquote truth. Um, I think something that cuts across all the domains is, again, that responsible use of AI in a variety of contexts. And finally, this is something that I think is more on that agency side of the last framework that we reviewed. And that is just developing a kind of personal stance, developing a sense of agency in a world with AI and developing a sense of agency during that interaction with the AI. So I don't quite know how to frame that other than with the word personal stance of just like, I know who I am and I know what I want and I know what I'm trying to achieve. And I know the extent to which this tool will help me get there and the extent to which it won't. And I make reasonable choices aligned with my own agency for the role I want AI to be playing in this moment and the way what it can do and what it should do in this moment and in my learning and in my life. So that I do think is a critical piece of AI literacy that I think is worth holding on to. Okay, so do we dare put another framework on the pile? Do we dare just add our voice to the chorus of voices that are already singing so loudly in this space? I don't know. I'm not so confident to think that the world needs another AI framework. But for myself, as I was thinking about my class, I was thinking about my students, I was thinking about my own professional development in this area. I just needed a framework that was easy to remember, easy to explain, broad enough that it could capture all those different facets, and also streamlined enough that I could actually design a class around it, that I could design a set of weekly meetings with my students around that framework. And so that's sort of what I was really driven by. So I came up with an attempt to synthesize all of this using alliteration mostly because I can remember alliteration. And I broadly considered like if I could put all of this together and synthesize this in some way, it would be awareness, application, accountability, and agency. Again, keeping that agency piece because I think it's really important. So awareness, I would just broadly fall under the basic functionalities of GenAI technology, how it became popularized, where it operates in our lived experiences. So can you recognize that there's an AI interface behind whatever it is you're interacting with? So I'd put all of that under the bucket of awareness. Under application, it would be the ability to test and evaluate a variety of different techniques for using generative AI tools for a variety of different purposes and in a variety of different circumstances. So actually giving students time to play with the tool, see if this thing or that thing works differently or better. So just yesterday, I asked my students to, in order to have the output be more relevant to their purpose, what if we really dug in on giving it more and more and more context? So iteratively building in the context and constraints, see if that helps produce better output, more relevant output. Or what if we double down on the personality? Because all these folks are saying you need to give your AI a personality, you need to give it a role, give it a persona. So what if we just really like articulate a beautiful, almost to the point of like this person could act on a stage, like they are getting stage direction. What if we double down on that? And I had the students test out both different techniques on the same task to see which technique was getting them the better outcome. It was mixed, honestly. Sometimes students got better outcomes by really drilling down on the persona, and other times they got better outcomes by giving the tool more and more and more constraint and context. And so that is what I mean by application, being able to test and evaluate those different techniques for putting input in and getting output out. Accountability, I would say, is the ability to demonstrate integrity when using generative AI and practicing the critical thinking towards how Gen AI is being used and the output that it's producing. So all of that I would put under the umbrella of accountability. And agency, again, is maintaining this control over how and when you use generative AI and being able to articulate a personal stance towards generative AI grounded by your own values. So, one of the things I had students do on the first day of class was just write out their personal Gen AI philosophy. This was not a very long document. I think it was a couple sentences. And I had students ranging so widely of just like, I'm going to use Gen AI for everything. Gen AI is already my best friend, to another person saying, if Gen AI does things for me, I've lost my humanity and I've lost my soul. And so the goal of my course is to actually have those two people be able to find some common ground and be able to talk meaningfully to each other. And if they can do that, then I will assume that both of them have achieved some level of critical generative AI literacy, not because they've changed their stances or because I've persuaded them to move in one way or another, but because their stance is informed by awareness, application, and accountability, and that agency is founded on a strong foundation, or it's grounded in something, right? So this is sort of what I came up with. What I tried to then do as I was planning my class was think about how all of these different forces things overlap, because there's so many different considerations for teaching AI literacy to your students. And so I thought, really thinking about how do we how would all of those different topics fit into a framework like this? Because these aren't discrete boxes, despite what this slide may have you believe. Actually, these things overlap, and the boundary between awareness and application is fluid, as is the boundary between agency and accountability is fluid. So, in these points of overlap, right, we can see that understanding the strengths, limitations, and biases of AI, that's somewhere in between awareness and application. You actually have to use the AI to see those limitations and see those strengths at work. I experienced that in my own journey when I started from skeptic and then I went to fear with my own AI journey. It's because I had to actually use it. I had to get not just learn about AI, I had to actually engage in the application of AI to see that. Same with agency. One thing that I think is really important with between agency and awareness is recognizing that students should be aware of the costs of generative AI, not just the social costs, environmental costs, but also other costs to their learning, to their thinking, and be able to practice consumer choice. So one thing that we discuss is the fact that these students have agency in voting with their feet, so to speak. I think that's the phrase, voting with their wallet, voting with their data. So they can choose which company they want to support with their use of these tools. They can demand social responsibility from these companies. The same way that this generation demands social responsibility from a lot of different companies that they interact with, they can do that with AI. Yes, of course. That's fine, Shelley. I think my slides will be available later. And if you want a better version of it, just reach out to me and I'm happy to provide it. So all of these things that I think we're working with, I think a simple framework and understanding the points of overlap can get students to that and can get that, get us there ourselves. But kind of holding on to those pillars, like at the end of the day, what is my awareness? How am I using or applying these tools? What level of accountability am I demonstrating in this use? And how agentic do I feel as a user of these technologies and as somebody who interacts with these tools? So I do think, though, that something that I have not seen at least articulated very well in any of the frameworks that I reviewed. And of course, I'm only human, so I haven't reviewed them all most likely, is an intentional focus on equity. And so, what would equity minded AI literacy look like? And to me, equity is would easily sort of be tacked on as an additional, I don't know, an additional consideration. But to me, equity mindedness is really about calling attention to inequitable patterns in experiences and outcomes broadly wherever they occur. So that means embedding equity as a central concern in a variety of different contexts. And from there, once you sort of apply, it's almost like a lens that you put onto your glasses to make everything kind of filtered through that lens. And once you can see the equity implications of many, many different things, then you can focus on actions that would disrupt those things, disrupt the social and cultural forces that are creating the inequities that you're witnessing. So it was really important to me as we were developing this course to really think broadly and equity mindedly about AI literacy. And to me, that meant kind of everything has to be put into this equity lens, or equity lens needs to be able to cut across all of these things. And so that meant sort of when we were thinking about what is AI, how does it work, where did it come from, we're also talking about the forces impacting the AI field. So if we think about the history of AI, who's most likely to be represented in the engineers who are building and training AI? We can think about, of course, the inequities in training data and the biased outputs that occurs. That's somewhere between awareness and application, right? So somebody brought up a really good example of language barriers, right? If you speak an indigenous language, you are not going to be able to interact with ChatGPT very well. ChatGPT performs very well with certain languages based on the availability of that language in its training data. So that's an equity lens, but still kind of aligned to this framework. Thinking about the reality of AI representations versus the reality of that in our world, and that cuts both ways. So when image generated tools first came out, I think we were all shocked and appalled by the kinds of stereotypical representations that we were seeing in those images. But I think it can also cut the other way, that these companies, in a desire to not produce these stereotypical representations, also represent a world that is more equitable than it is. It actually can obscure inequities that are still at work in our environment. So getting students to see that on both sides of that pendulum as well. Understanding that when it comes to accountability and how we give attribution to certain work, that all of this field of knowledge production is happening within a context of power relations. So who had the ability to have their work citable by the AI? Whose work was stolen? Whose work are you expected to cite now? And how would you cite work that's sort of been regenerated by multiple authors who may or may not have consented to have their work included in these models? That's an equity lens. I think when we talk about accountability, we often talk about, being upholding academic integrity, but we should also be informing students about how AI detection tools more often can be, can identify false positives for students who are non-native English speakers or who speak a language other than English as their primary language. We can talk about the inequitable access and privilege that different folks have in digital environments. So the ability to access ChatGPT 4 versus the free version. That's one aspect of this. And of course, when it comes to thinking about agency and awareness with an equity lens, we have to think about what informs our values, what informs our personal stance, and how are our personal stances different based on the communities that raised us and the goals that we have for our community, if you have goals for your community at all. All of those things, thinking about our identities and our experiences, all of that can pervade into an AI literacy framework. It's really quite robust. So I know I said I wanted to simplify this, but here I am making it more complicated again. But the goal really is to create that breadth, that there's a simple way to think about this, but within that simple framework, you can go deeper and deeper into that, and equity framing can be part of that. So I want to be mindful of our time. I was hoping we'd have a quick discussion of one of these dimensions and brainstorm ways that you might teach and assess it, what you would do, what you could look for in students' performance, and how comfortable would you be really doing that. But in the interest of time, we'll just keep going and hopefully we can have a longer Q&A. I will say there are some different strategies for assessing AI literacy that are already at work in the literature. That includes tests of AI knowledge. Honestly, this is like knowledge tests. So like what was the first neural network or something like that. So these are basic knowledge tests where students are reproducing, usually on the remembering and understanding side of Bloom's, like what these basic functionalities are. A lot of work that I found included self-assessment questionnaires and surveys to the students about their sense of AI literacy. Lots of multimodal projects, so having students produce things with AI or produce things related to AI and having different aspects of those projects. And then another way that folks are doing this is just by interviewing students and getting qualitative data. What I didn't see in the literature were rubrics. There are not a lot of rubrics on AI. If you go to AAC&U, you can get value rubrics on many different kinds of competencies, but not so for AI literacy just yet. And I think that's because I don't think many of us are comfortable at this date in time or moment in time framing these different AI literacy skills in terms of capstone, milestone, and benchmarks. Like, I don't quite think we're ready to articulate what an appropriate performance level is for all of this. And yes, and of course, AI is changing too quickly that once we articulated that rubric and got on the website, it would probably be out of date at this point. And so I think the field is really emergent there. And I think that lack of rubrics or that lack of ability or even confidence to articulate those performance levels, that should be instructive to us as educators. That in some ways, that kind of lets us off the hook. It lets us off the hook of having to be the arbiter or the decision maker about what AI literacy looks like when it's done really well and what it looks like when it's done less well. I think that right now, when we're in this emergent space, we should be taking in all of these different understandings of what competencies are and what competencies are related and starting to formulate what it looks like when it's done well and less well, rather than trying to find these rubrics that exist outside of us, because they're probably not going to come for a little while, is my guess. So but I do think that certain rubrics that already exist are still useful. I don't think they're useful wholesale. So I don't think you could just find a digital literacy rubric and it would just work for AI literacy. I don't quite think so. And that's why so many scholars have articulated frameworks that depart from digital literacy. But I do think there's pieces of digital literacy, information literacy, and ethical reasoning that all kind of come to play. And maybe together we can start synthesizing some pieces, taking from here, taking from there, pulling that all together into something that looks like an AI literacy rubric. Things like recognizing contextually bound authority, understanding how information is created, recognizing the value of different kinds of information and what goes into whether information is more or less valuable. Thinking about iterative inquiry. This is something that we think about a lot with information literacy. So not just doing one Google search for your sources and then that's it, but really thinking about iteratively building on those searches. That same set of mental habits of thinking about this as an iteration, learning from one attempt and iterating to the next, that's true of how we want students to be engaging with these tools as well. Technical proficiency in different environments, collaboration and problem solving, recognizing ethical issues, and then building ethical self-awareness. All of these things are competencies that are part of these existing rubrics, these existing core competencies. On their own, any one of these rubrics probably won't work for AI literacy. But if we think about the tenets of AI literacy that are emerging in the literature, and then we creatively scramble them with what we already have in terms of validated instruments for these other kinds of competencies, I think we can kind of get there. But GenAI presents this both a need and an opportunity to synthesize these frameworks and also expand them so that they actually apply to these new tools. So here's what I'm doing in my seminar. I don't know if this is the best thing to do, but it's what I'm doing. I'm doing pre and post unit surveys and reflections. So utilizing the awareness, application, accountability, and agency framework. That's how I divided up my class neatly, 25% in each bucket, and we kind of creatively mix and mingle between them across the different weeks. And then there's a pre and post survey for each of those units. I'm having the students do weekly journals. So every week they have to do some kind of AI activity. It's a scaffolded activity. I'm not just turning them loose, but I give them some basic instructions on interacting with a generative AI tool of their choosing. And then I give them a very basic reflection prompt about their experience, and students share those journals with me and with each other. They can also put their prompts whenever they engage with an AI, they can put their prompt in a repository, and students are encouraged to read each other's prompts so that they build that technical skill in the application arena of thinking about inputs and outputs for these tools. At the end of the class, we'll have some partner presentations. Students are able to choose their own topic. I have some preformed topics for them if they want to choose one of those, but one of my students is already interested in creating a set of AI policy guidelines for our university because we don't yet have AI policy guidelines for our university. Excuse me. And throughout the class, one thing that we're doing is that whenever a student uses generative AI, they are expected to use a GenAI acknowledgement statement. So we have some guidelines around what that means, around what a GenAI acknowledgement statement should entail, and they're being held accountable to actually making sure they do that. Now, am I putting their journal reflections through a Turnitin AI detector? No. But I am trying to create a culture of openness where this class is about generative AI. So you should feel free to use it, but feel free to use it in a way that prioritizes those 4 pillars. So prioritize your agency with how you use it and your accountability, which means you need to include some kind of GenAI acknowledgement statement as part of growing your accountability with these tools. So again, at the start of the hour, I asked, how can we teach students AI literacy when we ourselves are still developing our own sense of AI literacy? Here's what I think. Here's my answer that I've got so far. Check in with me in 6 months and see if it's radically different. I do think that we need both individual and institutional investment in AI-related professional development. This stuff takes time. It just takes time to learn. And whether we need to have university mandates, I don't know, but I do know we need institutional investment. Because if you're expected to maintain all of the functions of your position, whatever that entails, and also start to become an AI expert so that you can teach AI or think about AI in a variety of different contexts for biology, chemistry, psychology, sociology, that's impossible. So we do need some institutional investment in professional development for faculty and staff and students with these tools. But if you're like me, already find yourself in a position where you're working with students on generative AI literacy, whether it's an entire class or even just a piece of your class, I do think it's so important to just be transparent with your students about how we're all developing our literacy with these technologies, and to collaborate with your students as much as you can. I think if you can build in more room for play, discovery, and discussion rather than covering content, that really is also key. There's a lot of content to potentially go over, but there's also has to be a lot of room for trying these technologies out together and learning from each other. To that end, let the students teach each other with you in the room, of course, but be open to having them teach you as well. This idea of going into like double downing on the personality versus double down on the context sharing to see which one yielded a better result, that was a student's idea. And I thought, what a great idea. Let's try it. And so we did. And it was really interesting to see the results of that. And really what this comes down to is we really don't have any choice in when it comes to AI literacy. We really can't be the sage on stage in this context. We have to be the guide on the side. But to that end, I think your disciplinary expertise is quite relevant to how you engage AI literacy with your students. My background is in sociology and thinking about social and cultural forces that influence people's life outcomes. is a big part of how I approach equity in AI literacy. So your disciplinary context is still quite relevant, and you should bring that to your students, you should bring that to your colleagues, and they allow them to bring that to you as well. So here's the references. There's again, these slides will be available, so you're welcome to check these out. Like I said, there's many, many more references potentially out there. And with that, thank you. And hopefully we can have some time for some questions or comments, but feel free to connect with me after today. I'm happy to chat with any of you about AI literacy. Oh, Sierra, good question. In 6 months, what do I think might change? Well, first of all, I'm actually really curious if all of this effort and scaffolding that I'm doing with my students will result in them feeling like they have greater AI efficacy or AI literacy. I'm really curious to see if any validated instruments come out to help us externally evaluate or externally assess students' skills in this area. And I don't know, just as these tools get more and more evolved, and I shouldn't even say that because the tools aren't evolving like they're natural phenomena. As people who work in these corporations continue to grow and grow these functionalities in order to maintain their position in the marketplace, who knows? The future of AI is quite uncertain, I think. It is, yes, for sure.